For segment 3 of chapter 2, it starts on page 43 with the section entitled Brain Features That Are Visible to the Naked Eye. So it mostly focuses on brain features that we can physically see, starting with the temporal lobes, which are located on either side of your head. They mostly are responsible for receiving auditory information and processing that. Parietal lobes then lie between the frontal and occipital lobes. It mostly receives sensory information and participate in spatial cognition, while the frontal lobes, which are located anterior to the parietal lobes, are mostly involved in movement and high-level cognition. So this is the frontmost part of the brain. And the postcentral gyrus, which is located posterior to the central sulcus, receive somatosensory information from the entire body and are located in the parietal lobe. So that's why they're mostly involved with somatosensory information. And then the precentral gyrus is located anterior to the central sulcus and is contained in the frontal lobe, is crucial for motor control. For both the postcentral gyrus and the precentral gyrus, there's an orderly map of neurons that correspond to muscles for the precentral gyrus and somatosensory information on either side of the body. And then in undamaged lobes of the brain, they are continually communicating within themselves and their counterparts on either hemisphere to allow the brain to act as one unit. The structure that allows this to mostly happen is called the corpus callosum, which is a band of axons that connects the two hemispheres and allows this to occur. Then, visual-wise, there is gray matter and white matter within the brain, spanning the entirety of all the regions of the brain, especially in the cerebral cortex. The gray matter are areas of the brain that are composed mainly of unmyelinated cell bodies, and their main role is to receive and process information. They're darker in color to the white matter, which are covered with myelinated cell bodies, which is a fatty tissue. So they have a pale color, and they lie underneath the cortex, and their main role is to transmit information to other locations. Moving on to the section entitled Development Subdivisions of the Brain. The development of the brain in the embryo, the central nervous system starts out looking like a tube, and then it through further development and divisions of the cells that are composing it, composes three separate swellings, which then will eventually form the forebrain, hindbrain, and midbrain. But at first, the forebrain and hindbrain are the most clear subdivisions, and this original tube is called the neural tube. The definition being the embryonic structure with subdivisions that will correspond to the future forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, composed of the cells, and the interior is filled with fluid. So the five main sections of the brain overall, coming from this neural tube, are the mesencephalon, telencephalon, diencephalon, metencephalon, and myencephalon, but these can be further subdivided, and some of these are parts of a larger whole. Starting with the prosencephalon, which is the forebrain, which the telencephalon and diencephalon compose. The prosencephalon is defined as the interior portion of the brain containing the cerebral hemispheres, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. And within the prosencephalon, there's the telencephalon, which is the frontal subdivision of the forebrain that consists of the cerebral hemisphere has been fully developed. The diencephalon then is the back subdivision of the forebrain that consists of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Following is the mesencephalon, which is the midbrain, and just the middle division of the brain. There's not a whole lot that can be specifically characterized within the midbrain. So this in itself is a major section of the brain that can be further subdivided. The rhombencephalon hindbrain is defined as the posterior-most portion of the brain that consists of the medulla, pons, and cerebellum. Within the rhombencephalon is the metencephalon, which is a subdivision of the hindbrain that consists of the cerebellum and pons. The cerebellum being defined as a structure located at the back of the brain that is involved in the regulation of movement, while the pons is a portion of the brain stem connecting the midbrain to the medulla and has motor control and sensory nuclei. Also part of the rhombencephalon is the myencephalon, which is the medulla, and that is the posterior part of the hindbrain, which is continuous with the spinal cord. Overall, the brain stem composes the cerebellum, or midbrain, pons, and medulla, and it is defined as the region of the brain that consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla. Composing all of these specific regions are nuclei and tracts, and the nucleus is a collection of neurons within the central nervous system, while a tract is a bundle of axons within the central nervous system. Moving on, the next section is the brain, shows regional specialization of function. Mostly 100% of the time, brains are bilaterally symmetrical. Regions on both the left, there's regions of both lobes, and everything is mirror image on the left and right side of the brain, or the left and right hemispheres. Contrary to popular belief, the left side controls the right side of the body and vice versa, so the left side controls the right side of the body. And then the next section, the cerebral cortex performs complex cognitive processing. Within the cerebral cortex, neurons are arranged in 6 layers, each layer looking different based upon the bands of similar neurons within them, or patterns of dendrites or axons. Within the cerebral cortex, the allocortex, opposed to the cerebral cortex, some portions of the telencephalon are composed of only 3 layers as opposed to the 6 layers, and that is called the allocortex. Within the cerebral cortex, the neurons that compose these 6 layers are pyramidal cells and cortical columns. Pyramidal cells are a type of nerve cell that has a roughly pyramid-shaped cell body in the cerebral cortex, and they're composed of an apical dendrite and a basal dendrite. The apical dendrite is only one dendrite of each cell that extends from the top of the cell body to outermost layer of cortex, so it extends upward, while the basal dendrite, which is several dendrites that spread horizontally from the base of the cell body. Cortical columns then are one vertical column that constitute the basic organization of the neocortex. These cortical columns are known as information processing units, and they extend through the cortex from the white matter to the surface. And they have a synaptic interconnection of neurons that are vertical, but some are horizontal. The next section is subcortical structures are involved in movement and regulation of emotions. There's many clusters of gray matter structures that are interconnected, and everything listed below are these gray matter structures that are interconnected. First, there's basal ganglia, and they're a group of 4 brain nuclei that includes caudate nucleus, globus pallidus, and putamen that are found deep within the cerebral hemisphere and are reciprocally connected with the cerebral cortex, forming looping neural systems that contribute to motor control. They're mostly in the telencephalon only in the telencephalon under the cerebral cortex. Next is the substantia nigra, which is a brainstem structure in the midbrain that innervates the basal ganglia, which innervates to put an input in neurons, and they release dopamine, and they get their name from their dark color. The next is the limbic system, which is a loosely defined widespread group of brain nuclei that innervate each other to form a network that mostly function in emotion and learning. Within the limbic system is the amygdala, mammillary bodies, and the hippocampus. The amygdala is a group of nuclei in the medial anterior part of the temporal lobe and have a subdivision involved in emotion regulation and other perceptions. The mammillary bodies are a pair of nuclei at the base of the brain that function in memory and learning. The hippocampus is a medial temporal lobe structure, so the middle of the temporal lobe, that is important for learning and memory. The fornix then, which is also part of the limbic system, is a fiber that extends from the hippocampus to the mammillary body and functions in memory and learning. The next structure within these clusters of gray matter structures are septal nuclei, which are a collection of gray matter structures lying medially below the corpus callosum and are implicated in the perception of a word. Next is the cingulate gyrus, which is a cortical portion of the limbic system found in the frontal and parietal midline and are involved in the direction of attention. Next is the olfactory bulb, which is an anterior projection of the brain that terminates in the upper nasal passages and through small openings in the skull, which provide receptors for smell over the corpus callosum. Lastly, there's the stria terminalis, which is a limbic pathway connecting the amygdala and the hypothalamus, which functions in highly motivated behavior, as in sex, threat responses, etc., and integration of hormonal signals. The next section is the diencephalon, directs sensory information and control basic physiological functions. There's medial and basal aspects of the forebrain that are the two main components of the diencephalon. And those two main components are the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which were discussed earlier. The thalamus is the brain regions that surround the third ventricle, and they're a complex cluster of nuclei that directs sensory information to the correct area of the cortex and receives back to control sensory information that is transmitted. The hypothalamus then is also part of the diencephalon, lying ventral to the thalamus, so below it, and is packed with discrete nuclei involved in vital functions, as in hunger, thirst, temperature regulation, etc., and it also controls the pituitary gland. Because of this, the hypothalamus is the brain's main interface with the hormone system of the body. The next section is titled "The Midbrain Has Sensory and Motor Components." The midbrain has two motor centers, which are the substantia nigra, which was discussed earlier, and the red nucleus, which is defined as a brainstem structure related to motor control, communication with, and has communication with motor neurons in the spinal cord. As well, in the midbrain, there's several cranial nerves that originate here. The tectum then is the dorsal portion of the midbrain, which includes the inferior and superior colliculi. The superior colliculi are a pair of gray matter structures of the dorsal midbrain that receive visual information and are involved in the direction of visual gaze and visual attention to intended stimuli. The inferior colliculi then are paired gray matter structures of the dorsal midbrain that receive auditory information. Also included in the midbrain is the reticular formation, which is an extensive region of the brainstem spanning the medulla to the thalamus, so very long distance, that is involved in arousal, temperature regulation, and motor control. Next section is the cerebellum is attached to the pons and is crucial for motor control. The cerebellum consists of three layers that are involved in the function of coordination and control of movement, as well as some cognition. These three layers are composed of Purkinje cells, which are a type of large nerve cell in the cerebral cortex and have fan-shaped dendritic patterns. A granule cell then is a type of small nerve cell which are below Purkinje cells, where axons rise to the surface of the cerebellum, forming parallel fibers. These parallel fibers, which are also considered part of the three layers, are one of the axons of the granule cells that form the outermost layer of the cerebral cortex. The next section is the medulla maintains vital basic body functions. So for the most part, the medulla just basically is involved in arousal and regulating breathing and heart rate, and it also makes the transition from the brain to the spinal cord, and it is the bottommost part of the brainstem. Next section is behaviors and cognitive abilities are determined by functional connections between brain regions. So cortical regions communicate via tracts of axons looping through underlying gray matter. So these connections can either be lots long or short, and there's a lot of research being done right now to find the connectome of the human brain, or more commonly known as a map of the functional connections within and between the brain regions. The next section is specialized support systems protect and nourish the brain. The first support system that they discuss is the meninges, which are 3 protective sheets of tissue, including the dura mater, pia mater, and arachnoid, that surround the brain and spinal cord. Arranged in order from the outermost to the innermost is the dura mater, which is the outermost, and it is tough. The arachnoid, and it is a thin covering that lies between the dura and pia mater. Within the arachnoid is cerebrospinal fluid, and it's the fluid that fills the cerebral ventricles and has 2 functions, as a shock absorber and a medium for material exchange. While the pia mater is the innermost, it's very delicate and adheres tightly to the brain surface. Some associated diseases that come with the meninges are meningitis, which are an acute inflammation of the meninges and are usually caused by a viral or bacterial infection. And then there's meningiomas, which are several classes of non-cancerous tumors arising from the meninges. The next section is the cerebral ventricles, or chambers filled with fluids. So we have a large ventricular system within our brains, which is a system of fluid-filled cavities within the brain, this fluid being cerebrospinal fluid, which was defined, its functions were defined earlier. So the ventricular system is made up of a lateral ventricle, and it is obviously most lateral. Within the lateral ventricle, it is lined with a choroid plexus, which is a highly vascular portion of the lining of the ventricles that produces this cerebral spinal fluid. Then there is the third ventricle, which is the midline ventricle that conducts CSF from the lateral ventricle to the fourth. And then the last one, there is the fourth ventricle, which is the passageway within the pons that receive cerebrospinal fluid from the third ventricle and releases it to surround the brain and spinal fluid, and this lies between the cerebellum and pons. So overall, the ventricular system goes from lateral to third to fourth, and this is the overall description of the path of the cerebrospinal fluid. So then once it exits via these 3 openings in the cerebellum, it circulates over the surface of the brain and spine, and then CSF is then reabsorbed into the circular system through the veins beneath the top of the skull, and it enters back into the system. So it's similar to the circulatory system in that it constantly moves the cerebrospinal fluid through the nervous system. And that is segment 3 of chapter 2. Thank you.